The Nikon F-mount, a complex beast to understand after 60 years of modifications and additions. So now I'm going to explain it to you so you too can get your degree in optic mountology. Now the reason the F-mount seems so damn complicated with so many exceptions is because you don't actually look at the lens entirely to see if it's compatible with your camera. You need to look at what features of the lens are compatible. And the four main features of any kind of Nikon lens is the aperture control, focusing, distance and vibration reduction systems. And because the camera can be compatible with each one individually, it's entirely possible to use a lens on a camera with only some features active. For example, if you use the 200 to 500 on the f6, you can't stop down the aperture because it's an E aperture, but you can still focus the lens because it's an AFS lens. Thus it's compatible with some features and not others. So when understanding the aperture, there are two things to keep in mind: how the camera sets the lens aperture and how the camera knows which aperture for metering purposes. So to start with this, on the F-mount we need to go all the way back to the beginning. So I was born in, we need to go back even further than that dramatic event to the world, to 1959 with the release of the Nikon F, the first camera with an F-mount with the first lenses now referred to as the pre-AI lenses, like this 5cm f2 lens. So on pre-AI lenses, you select the aperture on the lens. You'll notice the aperture doesn't change in the lens when it's mounted on the camera. And this is because the camera is using a lever to hold the aperture wide open. So when you take a picture, the lever in the camera moves fully down, allowing the lens to stop down to whatever you set, and then it moves back up to hold the lens wide open when the exposure is finished. This automatic reopening of the aperture is what's referred to on these old lenses where it says auto. Now this works fine for taking pictures, but what if you want to add a meter to the camera that needs to read the aperture value from the lens? You will need a way for the movement of the aperture ring to couple to the meter to let it know how far you're stopping down the lens, and that is what this little prong is for. One issue with this prong system is that when you mount the lens, you have to crank the aperture ring backwards and forwards so the meter knows what range of apertures it's actually working with. To fix this lens shuffling, Nikon created the automatic indexing coupling system in 1977. Now this is a spring-loaded feeler around the lens mount, or on the prism in the case of the DP11 and DP12 prisms for the f2, that indexes to a cutout in the aperture ring so the meter knows how far the lens will be stopped down. And you can easily identify any AI-capable lenses by it having the aperture ring cut out like this. Now this removed the lens shuffle issue, but it meant you could not mount the older pre-AI lenses on these cameras. Some cameras like the F3 actually have a movable AI tab, so you can mount pre-AI lenses, but you will have to use stop-down metering when you do this. But honestly, at this point in time, it's just better to buy the AI version of the lens, unless you specifically want a pre-AI version for collecting reasons, like the reason I have a 5cm lens. So this AI system is all swell for Nikon for about 4 years until cameras start getting all electronic and these new exposure modes are happening, and Nikon wants to carve off a piece of that automatic exposure ass. But they run into a limitation with the AI lenses, and that is the fact that you select the aperture on the lens. But to have a shutter priority or program mode, you need to have the camera choose the aperture, but it can't. Now, I'm not actually counting goofy things like the DS12E aperture control unit for the f2. You should actually look that up. It's this goofy aperture ring motor that you could bolt onto the side of the camera. So the main difference between AI and AIS lenses is that the position of the aperture pin in AI lenses is not standardized, so the camera can't select a particular aperture. On AIS lenses, it is standardized, so the camera can accurately select an aperture value by moving the pin to a specific position. Now, to tell if a lens is AI or AIS, you need to look at the lens mount, and there will be a little cutout here next to the locking pin for the lens. This engages with a pin on the camera mount to tell it that it is using an AIS lens, and this is the only way to tell the difference between AI and AIS lenses. But that's not all. There's actually also this raised area, which is the smallest aperture notch, which tells the camera how far the lens can stop down. And it couples to this lever in the bottom of the lens mount, which can be found on the F4 and FA. This is needed for matrix metering on AIS lenses, and is also the reason there is this goofy metal prong sticking out the back of the 51.2 AIS lens. The smallest aperture notch is actually on some AI lenses as well, but I'm not sure how well this is used. I'm fairly sure it's only used for matrix metering on those lenses in some cameras. Next up we have the AIP lenses, which are the exact same as AIS, but these actually have a chip on them that tells the camera electronically all the lens details needed, so you don't need any funny coupling levers on the lenses or in the camera mount. This Voigtlander 58mm f1.4 is an example of an AIP lens. Now this chip is actually needed for some cameras like the f4 to enable all the exposure modes, but that's mostly because this camera is weird. Also, you can actually add these AIP chips to the older lenses so that they work better on more modern cameras instead of having to set the focal length and aperture value in the non-CPU lens option in the menus. Interestingly, the AF lenses with a chip are actually also AIP because they have an aperture ring with the AI cutout and the AIS nick in the lens mount, so you can actually use those lenses perfectly on older cameras that use AIP and AI lenses. Next, Nikon changed it all up and ditched the aperture ring altogether with the G lenses like this 50mm f1.8. Now with these G lenses, that means that any camera that relies on the aperture ring on the lens to select which f-stop to use can't use G lenses at all. You have to be able to select the aperture on the camera body itself. And this lens still has the aperture pin to control it, but no ring to set the value. But any of the more modern cameras like the f5 and f6 can use G lenses perfectly. And of course all the digital cameras as well. And then at the end of aperture development on the f mount we have the E lenses, where the controls are completely gone and the aperture is stopped down electronically. The 200 to 500 is an E lens, and you can tell it's an E lens because it says so on the lens. Now this style of aperture has clear benefits. Well, for Nikon anyway, because you don't have to build a very precise, complex mechanical linkage into the lens. Instead, all you need to do is just run a wire from the aperture mechanism to the mount to drive it. But this electronic control means that only digital cameras after like 2007, I believe, can actually stop these lenses down. And if the camera can't stop the lens down, the lens stays stuck wide open. Apparently Nikon developed this aperture system for the PC lenses, which are Nikon's tilt shift lenses. And this actually makes sense because it would be very hard, if not damn impossible, to have a mechanical linkage when the base of the lens is tilting and shifting about. But if you look at the older PC lenses like the 24mm, you might notice it actually has an aperture ring and a button after the tilty bit. So for these lenses, it's actually an E lens on bodies that can control it, but on older bodies you can set the aperture on the lens manually and then use the button to stop down the lens manually before you shoot. It's a really oddball system, but it does work on any camera that can power the lens. Hell, it even works on the f4 when the lens is not hitting into the prism because of the bulk of the tilt shift mechanism, but these PCE lenses are true oddballs with the weird stop down button. And with that, you now understand completely the difference between the different aperture types in Nikon lenses and how your camera is compatible with each one. Now on to the focusing systems. So, manual focus lenses. The focus works on everything because it's, well, manual. Anyway, so let's talk about AF lenses. So in the 1980s, we got this thing called autofocus. But to do that, the camera needs to be able to move the focus mechanism in the lens. So the first version of this was to add a motor to the camera and have this spinny screwdriver boy to couple to the lens to turn the focus mechanism about. I can only assume it was done this way because it was cheaper than adding a motor to every lens at the time. So in order to focus the lens, the camera would just spin the screwdriver back and forward and it would wind the lens mechanically back and forward. And the reliance on the screwdriver system is why these older AF lenses don't work on some cheaper cameras, because Nikon didn't add the motor to the camera body, nor did they add it to the FTZ adapters because Nikon refuses to make an adapter with one. Yes, I am still salty about this. Come on Nikon, make the damn FTZ with the focus motor already. Not a lot of people actually know about these AFI lenses. So when Nikon was doing this screwdriver autofocus thing, they also made some super telephoto lenses with an inbuilt motor, as I imagine it was not practical to move those massive glass elements with a little spinny motor in the body. Like, think about it, focusing a 600mm f4 really wouldn't work with that little dinky motor in the camera, would it? Next up we have the AFS lenses, which are lenses with the focus motor in the lens, and it is driven electronically by the camera like the 58mm AFS-G lens. Now the S is supposed to stand for silent wave motor, but it really just means any lens with an AF motor, even if it's a tiny crap micro motor with plastic gears like on the 105mm f1.4 lens. Note that an AFS lens is not the same as a G lens. There are actually a few AFS lenses with aperture rings like the 17 to 35mm f2.8, but these lenses still have an aperture ring so they can be used on older cameras, but focus manually, because Nikon. And then the last type of focusing system Nikon has is the AFP lenses, which as far as I can tell use stepper motors and are different from AFS lenses for some reason. I don't actually have an AFP lens, but as far as I know, the only ones of these I've seen are old DX lenses. But I think there is a few FX AFP lenses, however they're few and far between. These lenses are compatible with most digital cameras, although some may need a firmware update to work with them properly. Honestly, I just kind of ignore the AFP lenses anyway, because most of them just don't interest me at all. And then that's it for the different types of focusing systems in Nikon lenses. Now, one interesting lens tech introduced in the 90s was the D lenses. And this has actually got nothing to do with the AF lenses. So instead it marks the lens's ability to report the distance to the subject back to the camera, so the flash can be more accurately calculated based on the distance. But people tend to refer to the later version of the AF lenses as AFD lenses because there are a handful of them that have AF and AFD versions, so if you want the later version, you just use AFD to find it much easier. And then the last technology is VOR, which is the Nikon name for optical stabilization in the lens called vibration reduction. It's the same as OSS in Sony's teal and orange world or IS in Canon land. The only interesting thing about VOR is that it was actually introduced a lot earlier than I thought it was, and it is actually fully compatible on film bodies like the F5 and bodies after it like the F100 and the F6. So you can take advantage of vibration reduction on some film cameras, which is quite cool because it is very handy for getting sharp shots when your ISO options are highly limited and you end up in a low light situation and you need to push that shutter speed down quite a bit to get a decent exposure. And that's really it. So hopefully now you will understand a little more as to all the different types of Nikon lenses, how they work, why they're different, and which ones will work on your camera. And that's it for this video, guys. See you next time.